The night was unforgiving. Sarah Mitchell gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white from the cold. The heater blasted on full power, but it barely made a difference against the biting chill that seeped through the cracks of her old sedan. Outside, the world was a frozen wasteland. Snow-covered trees bent under the weight of the storm, and the empty roads stretched endlessly before her. She just wanted to get home. But then she saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, a dark figure barely visible against the pale white of the snow. It stood motionless near the tree line, partially hidden by the branches. Her pulse quickened. Was it an animal? A person? Sarah slowed the car, squinting as her headlights swept over the scene. That's when her stomach dropped. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a dog, a German shepherd, tied to a tree. And he wasn't moving. A sharp gasp left her lips. Without thinking, she slammed the brakes. The tires skidded against the icy pavement, her car coming to a jolting stop on the side of the road. Sarah barely noticed. Her hands were already fumbling with the door handle, shoving it open as a gust of frigid wind blasted against her face. She ran. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she stumbled toward the dog, her breath coming in fast, panicked gasps. The closer she got, the worse it became. His fur, once thick and proud, was now matted and frozen, coated in ice. His ribs were visible beneath the thin, ragged coat, his body too still. The rope around his neck dug deep into his flesh, frozen solid against the bark of the tree, as if someone had tied him there and left him to die. Sarah's heart pounded violently in her chest. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice shaking. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands trembling as she reached out. "Hey, buddy," she murmured softly, praying for a reaction. Nothing. Panic flared in her chest. Desperate, she pressed her fingers against his side. A faint rise and fall. He was still alive. A rush of emotion slammed into her, almost bringing tears to her eyes. But she wasn't too late. Not yet. Sarah acted fast. She reached for the rope, her frozen fingers clawing at the knot, trying to loosen it. But it was rock solid, frozen in place by the ice. She pulled harder, her breath fogging up in the cold air, but the rope wouldn't budge. Who could do something this cruel? The dog let out a faint, broken whimper. Sarah's throat tightened. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm going to get you out of here. Just hold on." Her hands shook as she yanked off her gloves, ignoring the burning cold as she reached into her pocket, pulling out her car keys. If she couldn't untie the rope, she'd cut it off. Her numb fingers fumbled as she jammed the sharp metal edge against the frozen knot, scraping at the thick layer of ice. Tiny shards splintered away, but the knot remained stubbornly intact. Tears pricked her eyes. She was running out of time. The shepherd let out another weak, pain-filled whimper. Sarah gritted her teeth, pressing the key harder, her fingers stinging as the ice scraped against her skin. Then, a crack. The ice splintered, the rope loosened. With a final desperate yank, the knot gave way, the rope falling limply into the snow. Sarah barely had time to react before the dog collapsed against her. His body went completely limp. Her heart stopped. "No, no, no." She pressed a shaking hand to his chest, still breathing, but barely. She had freed him, but it wasn't enough. If she didn't get him warm now, he wouldn't make it. With every ounce of strength left in her, Sarah lifted him into her arms. He was far too light for a dog his size, his body weak from hunger and the cold. His head lolled against her shoulder, and for a terrifying moment she thought he had stopped breathing. But then, the faintest sigh escaped his cracked, frozen lips. Sarah clenched her jaw. "I got you," she whispered fiercely. "I'm not letting you go." Ignoring the snow cutting against her exposed skin, she staggered toward the car, holding the shepherd tightly against her chest. She didn't know if she was already too late. She didn't know if he could hold on. But she did know one thing. She wasn't leaving him behind. The world blurred around Sarah as she sprinted back to the car, her boots crunching against the snow-covered road. The German shepherd, barely alive, lay limp in her arms, his body so fragile it sent a sharp ache through her chest. He was too cold, too weak. She threw open the car door, carefully laying him across the passenger seat. The icy wind howled through the open door, but she didn't care. Her hands were already fumbling for the heater. Max heat. Full blast. Now. The car filled with warm air, but it wasn't enough. The dog's breathing was too shallow, his ribs barely moving. Her hands trembled as she yanked off her coat, wrapping it around him as tightly as she could. "Stay with me, buddy," she whispered, her voice breaking. No response. Sarah's heart pounded violently as she threw the car into drive. The tires screeched against the frozen road as she sped forward, her headlights cutting through the darkness. The nearest vet clinic was at least 20 minutes away. She didn't have 20 minutes. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she stole frantic glances at the dog beside her. His body barely moved, his fur stiff with ice, her stomach twisted painfully. She had found him just in time, hadn't she? She had to. Gritting her teeth, she reached over with one hand, gently pressing her palm against his freezing chest. She barely felt a heartbeat. No, 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 no. Sarah's breath came fast and shallow. She needed to warm him up. Now. Desperate, she tore off her gloves and placed both bare hands against his ribs, pressing firmly against his ice-cold fur. The contact sent shivers through her body. God, he was so cold. Her throat tightened as she leaned closer, letting the heat from her own body seep into his. "Come on, baby," she whispered. "You have to fight." The road stretched endlessly ahead, the dark forest on either side blurring past as she pushed the speed limit, her breath fogging up the windshield. And then, a weak, broken whimper. Sarah's eyes snapped to the German shepherd. His nose twitched slightly, a faint, rasping breath escaping his lips. Oh my God. Tears burned behind her eyes as she tightened her grip on the wheel, pressing her palm firmly against his chest. "You're going to be okay," she whispered fiercely. "I won't let you go." The car barreled down the road, skidding slightly on the ice as she sped through the empty streets. Then, finally, the fluorescent glow of the vet clinic's emergency sign appeared in the distance. Sarah's hands tightened on the wheel. "Hold on, buddy," she choked out. "We're almost there." The moment Sarah's car screeched to a stop in front of the clinic, she threw open the door and bolted around to the passenger side. She didn't even feel the freezing wind as she gathered the dog in her arms, his fragile body barely responsive. "I need help," she shouted. The clinic doors burst open, and a vet tech in scrubs and a winter coat rushed toward her. "Bring him inside," the woman ordered. Sarah staggered through the doors, her heart pounding violently as the warmth of the clinic enveloped her. But the shepherd didn't move. The vet tech directed her to a treatment table, where another staff member was already preparing supplies. Sarah gently laid the dog down. He still wasn't responding. A machine beeped, and the vet tech pressed a stethoscope to his frail chest. Her face tightened. "His breathing is shallow," she murmured. "Too slow." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "He was tied to a tree," she choked out. "Out in the snow. I don't know how long he was there." The vet tech's eyes darkened with something sharp. Anger, maybe. "We'll do everything we can," she promised. "Get Dr. Carter in here," someone called. A moment later, a tall woman in a white coat rushed in, her brown hair tied back in a messy bun, her eyes sharp and focused. "What's his temperature?" Dr. Emily Carter asked, her voice calm but urgent. A nurse checked the screen and grimaced. "Too low to read." Sarah's stomach dropped. Dr. Carter didn't hesitate. "We need IV fluids, heat pads, and oxygen. Now." Sarah watched, helpless, as the team sprang into action. Warm blankets were wrapped tightly around the shepherd's frail body. A catheter was inserted into his leg, an oxygen mask placed gently over his muzzle. Sarah swallowed hard. He had to make it. Minutes stretched into eternity as the team worked, their voices low and urgent. Dr. Carter checked his heartbeat, her brow furrowing. "His pulse is weak," she murmured, "but stable." Sarah let out a shaky breath. Is he going to survive? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter exhaled slowly. It's too soon to tell, she admitted. Sarah's chest tightened painfully. But then Dr. Carter glanced down at the frail shepherd, her expression softening just slightly. He's still fighting, she said. Sarah bit her lip hard, tears threatening to spill over. That was enough. For now, it was enough. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she gently brushed against the shepherd's matted fur. You're not alone anymore, she whispered. The dog didn't respond. But then, his ear twitched. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She let out a soft, broken laugh, her fingers curling into the blanket beside him. That's it, she whispered. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. The sterile beeping of the heart monitor echoed through the dimly lit treatment room. Sarah sat at the edge of a chair, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The German shepherd, her dog now, lay motionless on the padded table, his frail body still wrapped in heated blankets. The oxygen mask over his muzzle rose and fell with shallow, weak breaths. Dr. Carter stood nearby, checking his vitals. He's holding on, she murmured. Sarah swallowed hard. The relief that surged through her chest was so overwhelming that she had to grip the sides of the chair just to steady herself. It had been hours since she had found him tied to that tree. Hours since she had carried his frozen body through the snow, since she had prayed, begged for him to survive. And now he was still here, alive. But the fight wasn't over. Dr. Carter turned to Sarah, her expression calm but serious. He's severely malnourished, she explained. His muscles have deteriorated from starvation, and prolonged exposure to the cold has weakened his immune system. Sarah's stomach twisted painfully. How bad is it? She whispered. Dr. Carter sighed, rubbing her temples. I won't lie, it's bad, she admitted. But I've seen dogs come back from worse. His vitals are weak, but his body hasn't completely shut down. That means there's a chance. Sarah nodded quickly. Then I'll do whatever it takes. Dr. Carter studied her carefully, as if assessing whether she really understood the gravity of the situation. This won't be easy, she warned. Rex? Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Wait, she straightened. Did you just say Rex? Dr. Carter hesitated. That's the name registered to his microchip, she said carefully. Does it sound familiar? Sarah felt her throat tighten. Rex. Even though he lay there motionless, the name felt right. She glanced at him, his shaggy fur, his worn-down frame, his lifeless eyes that had once held so much pain. And she knew. Rex. That was who he was. She clenched her fists, and no one, not the man who abandoned him, not the people who had ignored him, was going to take that from him ever again. She met Dr. Carter's gaze. His name is Rex, she said firmly. Dr. Carter gave a small nod. All right, she said. Then let's fight for him. The first night was brutal. Sarah refused to leave. She sat by Rex's side, watching every slow, weak breath, flinching at every quiet whimper that escaped his lips. When he shuddered in his sleep, she gently brushed her fingers over his head, whispering, It's okay, buddy. You're safe now. When his legs tensed, like he was reliving something awful in his dreams, she placed a steadying hand on his ribs and said, I've got you. She had never cared for a dog this way before. But this wasn't just any dog. This was Rex, and she wasn't going to let him go. By the second day, Rex was still weak, but something changed. Sarah had been sitting next to him, exhausted from lack of sleep, when she suddenly felt it. A small, barely there pressure against her leg. Her breath hitched. Rex, without even lifting his head, had inched his paw forward until it rested against her knee. Sarah froze, her heart pounding violently. It was so small, so faint, but to her it was everything. She choked back a sob, her fingers trembling as she gently placed her hand over his paw. I'm here, she whispered. Rex didn't move again, but he didn't pull away either. And for Sarah, that was enough. That night, as the clinic fell into silence, Sarah found herself thinking about his previous owner, the man who had left him to die. She remembered his cold voice on the phone, Got rid of him days ago. He was useless, weak. Her hands tightened into fists. Who the hell could do this? Rex was gentle. Rex was trusting. Rex hadn't given up, not even when the world had turned its back on him. And someone had tried to throw that away like it was nothing. Sarah clenched her jaw. She didn't know what it would take, but one thing was certain. She was going to find out the truth. And whoever did this to Rex was going to regret it. The third day was the biggest breakthrough. Sarah had just returned from grabbing a cup of coffee when Dr. Carter met her at the door, her expression different this time. He's awake. Sarah's heart stopped. She rushed into the treatment room, barely breathing, and froze. Rex was lying on his side, his head barely lifted off the blanket. His brown eyes, the same ones that had been lifeless and dull just days before, were open, and they were looking right at her. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She took a step forward, afraid he might disappear if she blinked. Then, his tail. It twitched. Once, twice. Sarah choked on a breath, feeling hot tears burn in her eyes. She had never cried in front of anyone before. But now, she didn't care. She rushed to his side, gently brushing a hand over his head. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Rex let out a soft huff. Not a bark, not a whimper. But it was the first noise he had made since she found him. Sarah let out a watery laugh. "You scared me, you know that?" Rex blinked slowly, and then he did something that completely shattered her. He pressed his nose against her palm. Sarah's breath caught. A single tear slipped down her cheek as she gently cupped his face, stroking his fur. "You're safe," she whispered. And this time, Rex believed her. The world had given up on him, but Sarah never did. Rex was alive, he was awake. But the road to recovery was far from over. 2 days after Rex first opened his eyes, Dr. Carter gave Sarah the news she had been waiting for. He's strong enough to try standing. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment, praying for it. But when she kneeled beside him, speaking softly, trying to encourage him, Rex didn't move. His ears twitched, his eyes flickered with something, uncertainty, but his body remained still. Sarah frowned. "Come on, buddy. You can do this." She gently reached for his front leg, applying a little pressure. But the second she did, Rex flinched violently, his body tensing as if expecting pain. Sarah froze. His eyes widened, his breath hitched, and for the first time since waking up, fear flickered across his face. Sarah's stomach twisted painfully. He wasn't just weak, he was scared. Sarah pulled her hand away slowly. "I won't hurt you," she whispered. Rex stared at her, his ears flat against his head. For a second she swore she saw a flicker of recognition, like he wanted to believe her. But something deep inside him was holding him back. Sarah's chest tightened. She had seen scared dogs before, rescues who had been abused or neglected. But Rex? This was different. This wasn't just fear. This was learned helplessness. Rex had been taught, through pain, through cruelty, through who knows how much suffering, that fighting back was useless. Her hands clenched into fists. She could feel the rage rising inside her again. That man, the one who had tied Rex to a tree and left him to die, what had he done to him? Sarah took a slow, steadying breath. Rex needed patience, not frustration. She wasn't going to push him. Instead, she gently placed her hand next to his paw, not touching, just close enough that he could move if he wanted to. And then, she waited. Minutes passed. Sarah didn't move a muscle. And finally, ever so slowly, Rex shifted his paw forward. It was barely a movement, a fraction of an inch. But Sarah felt tears burn behind her eyes. It was something. And something was enough. Over the next few days, Sarah and Dr. Carter worked tirelessly to help Rex regain his strength. Each day, they encouraged him, a little at a time. At first, it was just lifting his head. Then it was moving his front paws. By the end of the week, Rex was standing, unsteady, shaking, but standing. And then came the biggest challenge yet, his first walk. Sarah clipped a soft, padded leash onto his new collar, crouching beside him. "No rush," she said gently. "Just take your time." Rex hesitated. He looked at the open doorway, at the world beyond the clinic, and froze. Sarah held her breath. This was it. Would he take the step forward? Would he trust her? Seconds felt like hours. Then, Rex lifted his paw. Sarah's heart leapt. And then, he took a step. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't fast. But every single step felt like a miracle. Rex wobbled, but Sarah was right there, guiding him, steadying him. When they finally reached the end of the hallway, she let out a soft laugh, tears brimming in her eyes. You did it, she whispered. You really did it. For the first time since she had found him, Rex looked up at her, and his tail wagged. Once. Twice. Sarah laughed breathlessly. You're going to be okay, she whispered, running a hand gently over his fur. I promise. Rex pressed his nose against her palm. And this time, he believed her. Just when Sarah thought Rex's new life was beginning, reality came crashing down. Because the man who had left him to die, the one who had tied him to that tree and walked away without looking back, he wasn't finished. And he wanted Rex back. Sarah had fought so hard to save him. She had nursed him back to life. And now, the man who left him to die wanted him back. Over her dead body, Sarah had just finished helping Rex walk around the clinic for the third time that day. He was getting stronger, his legs no longer trembling with every step. It was the first time she truly felt hope. Then her phone rang. The vet clinic's receptionist poked her head into the hallway, her face pale. Sarah, she said hesitantly, there's someone on the phone for you. Sarah frowned, wiping her hands on her jeans. Who? The receptionist bit her lip. The man who owned Rex. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She stormed into the front office and snatched the phone from the counter. This is Sarah. Silence. Then, you stole my dog. The voice on the other end was low, cold, and dangerous. Sarah's grip tightened. You left him tied to a tree in the middle of a snowstorm, she shot back. You don't deserve to call him yours. The man laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. I don't care what you think, he sneered. He's my property, and I'm coming to take him back. Sarah's heart pounded. Over my dead body, she thought. But before she could respond, the line went dead. Dr. Carter found Sarah still clutching the phone, her knuckles white. I heard, the vet said quietly. Sarah turned to her, anger and fear boiling inside her. He's coming. Dr. Carter folded her arms. Then we better be ready. Rex lay nearby on a dog bed, his ears flicking as he watched them. Sarah knelt beside him, running a hand gently over his back. You're not going back to him, she whispered fiercely. Rex leaned into her touch, trusting her, and that was all the motivation she needed. She wasn't just going to protect him. She was going to fight for him. Sarah knew she couldn't just wait for the man to show up, so she called the sheriff. Sheriff Evans was a no-nonsense, straight-to-the-point kind of guy. He listened as Sarah explained everything, how she had found Rex, how the man had abandoned him, and how he was now demanding him back. When she finished, the sheriff let out a long sigh. I'll be honest, Sarah, he said. Legally, he still owns the dog. Sarah's stomach dropped. But, Evans continued, we have strong evidence of abuse. If we take this to court, there's a good chance we can permanently revoke his ownership. Sarah's fists clenched. But what if he doesn't wait for court? She asked. Evans's expression darkened. Then he'll wish he had. It happened sooner than expected. The next day, as Sarah was finishing feeding Rex, a truck screeched into the clinic's parking lot. Sarah looked up sharply. The man climbed out. She recognized him instantly. Tall, broad-shouldered, eyes filled with cruelty. He looked furious, and he was headed straight for the clinic doors. Sarah barely had time to react before he shoved them open, stepping inside. His eyes locked onto Rex. There you are, he muttered. Let's go, Mutt. Rex froze. Sarah saw it, his body tensing, his ears flattening, his breath hitching. Fear, raw, deep, paralyzing. Sarah stepped between them, her heart pounding. He's not going anywhere with you. The man's face twisted into a sneer. You have no right to keep him. Sarah lifted her chin. I have every right. Legally, the man growled. He's still mine. Sarah's jaw clenched. Not anymore. The man took a threatening step forward. Sarah didn't back down, and then the clinic door slammed open again. Sheriff Evans walked in, hand resting on his holster. "Step away from the dog," he ordered. The man's eyes narrowed. "This is none of your business." Evans tilted his head. "See, that's where you're wrong." He pulled out a folder. "The state of Montana takes animal abuse very seriously," he said, flipping through a few papers. "And after reviewing the evidence, your phone call, your lack of a missing pet report, the medical examination proving neglect," he snapped the folder shut. "The dog no longer belongs to you." Sarah's heart jumped. The man's face twisted with rage. "You can't do this." Evans stepped closer. "I can," he said, "and I just did." The man looked ready to explode, but then he looked at Rex, at the dog he had broken, at the dog he had left for dead, and he laughed bitterly. "Fine," he spat. "Keep the damn mutt. He's worthless anyway." Sarah saw red. She wanted to scream, to tell him that Rex was more than he could ever deserve, but she didn't need to. Because Rex, he lifted his head, slowly, steadily, and in one powerful moment, he growled, a deep, warning growl. The man's smirk faltered. Rex was done being afraid. Sheriff Evans grabbed the man's shoulder. "Time for you to leave." The man gritted his teeth. Then he turned and walked out. Sarah let out a shaky breath, and as soon as the truck roared away, she dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around Rex. "You're safe," she whispered. Rex leaned into her. He believed her. And this time, it was forever. Sarah had won the battle. But the scars of the past don't fade overnight. Rex still had fears to overcome. Could he truly heal? Could he learn to be happy again? Sarah was determined to help him find out, because for the first time in his entire life, he had someone who refused to give up on him. And that changed everything. Sarah had saved him. She had fought for him. And now, she had to teach him that he was safe. But some wounds don't heal overnight, and Rex's past wasn't done haunting him yet. It had been 2 weeks since Rex's former owner tried to take him back. 2 weeks since Sarah won. 2 weeks since Rex finally belonged to someone who loved him. But winning ownership didn't erase the scars he carried. Rex was safe now, but his heart didn't know it yet. Sarah saw it in his eyes, in the way he flinched at sudden movements, in the way he slept so lightly, always half awake, like he was waiting for something bad to happen. It broke her heart. She wanted to show him that life could be beautiful again. But how do you teach a dog that has only known pain to trust? Sarah didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to give up on him. The first time Sarah tried taking Rex for a walk outside, he refused to move. She clipped the leash onto his collar, and he froze. His whole body tensed, his breathing shallow and fast. Sarah knelt beside him, speaking softly. "Hey, buddy, it's okay. I'm not taking you away. You're safe here." But his legs wouldn't move. For Rex, a leash had never meant freedom. It had meant control, punishment, and fear. Sarah's chest tightened. She didn't pull, she didn't push, she just waited. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, Rex took one step forward. Sarah smiled. "That's it, buddy." Another step, then another. The walk wasn't long, but it was everything, because for the first time, Rex had chosen to move forward. That night, Sarah woke to a sound that shattered her heart. Whimpering, not soft, not weak, panic-filled, broken whimpering. She turned over and saw Rex trembling in his sleep, his paws twitching, his ears flattened, and then a sharp, pained yelp. Sarah's chest ached. She sat up slowly, moving carefully so she wouldn't scare him. "Rex," she whispered. His eyes shot open. His whole body jerked up, panting, eyes wide with fear. For a split second, Sarah could tell he wasn't here. He was back there, back in the cold, back in the dark, back in the pain. Sarah didn't reach for him. She just laid back down, giving him space. "You're okay," she whispered into the quiet night. "It was just a dream. You're safe now." She closed her eyes, letting him decide if he trusted her words. A minute passed, then another. Then, a soft, heavy weight pressed against her legs. She opened her eyes and saw Rex curling up beside her. His breathing was still uneven, his eyes still haunted. But he was there, and that was enough. Sarah knew Rex had spent his whole life expecting pain, so she decided to show him love in every small way possible. She spoke softly, she moved gently, she let him come to her on his own terms. She discovered his favorite things: warm blankets fresh out of the dryer, the smell of bacon cooking in the morning, the way the sun felt when it hit his fur just right. He was learning. Little by little, day by day, but the real test was still to come. One afternoon, Sarah decided to take Rex into town for the first time. It was quiet, just a few people walking along the sidewalk, the scent of fresh bread coming from the bakery, the sound of cars passing by. At first, Rex seemed okay. He walked beside Sarah, his ears perked but relaxed. Then it happened. A truck rumbled past, loud and heavy, its tires crunching against the pavement. Sarah barely noticed it. But Rex? He froze. His body went stiff as a board, and before Sarah could react, he panicked. He pulled back, yanking against the leash, his breathing rapid, his eyes wild. Rex. But he wasn't listening. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark, somewhere cold. Sarah's heart ached, she knew. The truck, it must have reminded him of the one his old owner drove, of the place where he had been abandoned, where he had nearly died. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him. She didn't pull him forward. She didn't force him to move. She just held his face gently in her hands. "Rex," she whispered. His eyes flickered to hers. "You're here. You're not there anymore. Look at me." His chest heaved. His body trembled. Then slowly, so slowly, his breathing began to slow. Sarah stroked his fur, whispering over and over, "You're safe. You're safe. You're safe." And for the first time in his life, Rex believed it. Healing wasn't a straight path. Some days Rex was brave. Some days he flinched at shadows. Some days he let Sarah hug him close. Some days he still slept on the floor, as if afraid the warmth of the bed wasn't really his to have. But every day he fought, and every day Sarah fought with him, because he wasn't alone anymore. Not in his fear, not in his pain, not in his healing. She had saved him once, and she would keep saving him every single day. He was learning to trust. He was learning to love. But was he ready to let go of the past completely? Sarah had one final test in mind, something that would prove once and for all that Rex was free. Rex had come so far, from the frozen darkness of abandonment to the warmth of love, from fear to trust, from surviving to living. But Sarah knew he wasn't free yet, because the past still had one last chain around his heart, and today she was going to help him break it forever. Sarah had one last challenge for Rex. It had been 3 months since she found him, weak, starving, and tied to that tree in the freezing cold. And now she was taking him back to the place where his old life ended and where his new life began. The road stretched ahead, quiet and endless. Rex sat in the passenger seat, his body relaxed but his eyes alert. Sarah glanced at him. "You ready, buddy?" she asked softly. Rex didn't move at first. Then, slowly, his tail gave a small, steady wag. Sarah smiled. He was ready. The trees loomed tall and silent. The wind whispered through the bare branches. Sarah parked the car and stepped out. Rex hesitated, his nose twitching as he caught the familiar scent of snow, pine, and something deeper, memories. Sarah waited. She didn't call him. She didn't rush him. She let him decide. Then, with careful steps, Rex climbed out of the car, and together they walked into the past. It was still there, the tree where Rex had been left to die. The bark was scarred from where the frozen rope had dug deep. Sarah swallowed hard. She turned to Rex, watching for any sign of fear. He stood still, staring at the tree. For a long moment, he didn't move. Sarah's chest tightened. Was this too much? Then, Rex took a step forward. His ears twitched. His tail flicked once. He sniffed the tree, his nose touching the exact spot where the rope had been. Sarah held her breath. Then something amazing happened. Rex lifted his leg and marked the tree. Sarah's eyes widened, and then she laughed. "You tell it, buddy," she said, grinning. This wasn't a place of pain anymore. It was his. his past, his battlefield, his victory. Rex had just claimed it for himself. And that's when Sarah knew. He was free. From that day forward, Rex was different. His steps were lighter, his eyes were brighter, his tail wagged more often, and for the first time, he played. Not just running beside Sarah, not just chasing a ball, but really played, jumping, rolling, barking with joy. He was no longer haunted by the past, because he had survived it, and now, he was ready for forever. One evening, as the sun set in golden hues, Sarah clipped a new tag onto Rex's collar. Rex tilted his head, his tail wagging curiously. Sarah smiled, running a hand through his fur. "You're home, Rex," she whispered. And on his tag, engraved in bold letters, was a single word: loved. And for the first time in his life, Rex truly believed it. Rex's story was one of pain, of survival, of healing. But most of all, it was a story of love. And love always finds a way. Thank you for following Rex's journey. If his story touched your heart, share it to remind the world that every abandoned soul deserves a second chance.